Now today we are going to study about probability. Many times we come across this word probability in daily life also. For example, sometimes we may have a look at the skies and we may say this thing that there is a very high probability of rain today, or we may say like this, it is improbable for Kenya to win against India in a cricket match. Now today we are going to look at this word probability with respect to mathematics. In mathematics, what is the meaning of this word and how we can find out probability of different events. Now firstly I am going to talk about some simple definitions which are related to the topic which we use, and second is concept of probability, third is the types, and fourth is the formula used. So firstly come to simple definitions related to the topic. So one word which we used so many times in this topic is experiment. So what is the meaning of this word experiment? Now you might have done some experiments in the lab and you may say that experiment means we go somewhere and we do something, but mathematically what is the meaning of this word when we are using this word in probability? Now, an experiment is a process which results in well-defined outcomes. Now what is the meaning of this word outcome? Now you might not have heard this word before. So this outcome word simply means the result. If we are doing some kind of process, it will result in something. So this word outcome means the result. So experiment is nothing but a process which will result in some well-defined outcomes. What is this well-defined I am talking about? Let us take an example. Let us say that if I am tossing a coin. So I will say that the experiment is tossing the coin. There are two well-defined outcomes. What are those two well-defined outcomes? Either it will be heads or it will be tails. So two well-defined outcomes. An experiment, as I have already told you. Now after that we come to the next thing. The next is a random experiment. Now we already talked about experiment. What is experiment? A process which results in well-defined outcomes. What is random experiment? Now this random word you might have come across in some other topics also. You might have studied in science also. Random motion means the particle moves in zigzag manner and so on. So here random experiment means the process will have well-defined outcomes, but we cannot predict in advance. So if I say random experiment, that means that suppose I am tossing a coin, well-defined outcomes are getting heads or tails, but we cannot predict in advance that whether heads is going to come or tails is going to come. So in that case, the experiment of tossing a coin will become a random experiment. Another example of random experiment is throwing a die. So if I throw a die, there are 6 numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Any one of those 6 numbers can come. I cannot predict in advance that only 6 is going to come or only 5 is going to come. So if I cannot predict in advance, that experiment will be called as random experiment. So we talked about these two. Now the third thing which we are going to talk about here is sample space. So what is sample space in probability? Now sample space means the collection of all possible outcomes in case of any particular experiment. For example, if I am tossing a coin, then there are two outcomes possible. Either heads will come or tails will come. I write H for heads, T for tails, and these two brackets, I am using these curly brackets over here to denote a set. So this is a set which contains two elements. First one is heads, second one is tails. So this will be sample space. Sample space is denoted by S. So in case of tossing a coin, the sample space will be H, T. Now suppose I am throwing a die which is containing numbers from 1 to 6. So in that case, the sample space will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Because out of these 6 numbers, any number may come. These are all outcomes. This is first outcome, second outcome, third outcome. So if I list down all the outcomes in the form of a set, this set will be called as sample space. Now after sample space, we come to another word which is event. An event is basically something which happens. We write over here event. Event is something which happens. For example, if I am throwing a die, I may get a number greater than 3 or less than 3. So getting a number greater than 3 will be an event. Getting a number less than 3 will also be an event. If I take a very simple event, I can say like this: coming of 1 in the throw of a die, that will also be an event. Coming of heads in the toss of a coin, that will also be an event. Now after event we come down to another very important thing, which is equally likely outcomes. What is the meaning of this whole term? Equally likely outcomes. Now, as I explained to you earlier, that if we are tossing a coin, there are two outcomes which are possible, heads and tails. So, if I am tossing a coin, heads can come or tails can come. I have already told you, this is a random experiment. We cannot predict in advance whether heads will come or tails will come. So therefore, these two outcomes, both of them are equally likely to occur. Equally likely to occur means both of them, heads or tails, we can say like this, 50-50 chances are there that heads will come or tails will come. 50% chances of this and 50% chances of this. And therefore, these outcomes will be called as equally likely outcomes. Same way in the throw of a die also, these 6 numbers, all of them are equally likely, because we cannot say that one is having more probability of coming and 2 is having less probability of coming. If I throw a die, only 6 will come. I cannot say like that. So therefore here, all these 6 outcomes are equally likely. That means all of them have equal percentage of coming or equal probability of coming. We will talk about that a little later also. Now we have talked about the simple definitions related to the topic. Next we will go to the concept of probability. Now let us go to the concept of probability. I have already explained to you earlier. I told you like that we can have a look at the skies and say this thing, there is a very high probability of rain today. So what is the meaning of that thing? When we say there is a high probability of rain, what is the meaning of that thing? Now probability is basically the likelihood of any event happening. For example, the event may be it's raining or it may rain, so that may be the event. So we can say that there is a very great likelihood of rain coming down. So therefore here probability is nothing but the likelihood of any event happening. So that is the concept of probability. I may say like this, that if there is a match between India and Kenya, then I can say that there is a very high probability of India winning. That means there is a very great likelihood of India winning the match. So we have done this concept of probability. Now we will come to the types of probability. Basically there are two types of probability. The first one is called as empirical and the second one is called as classical. Now this empirical, it is also called as experimental probability. Now, what is the meaning of this? Now, suppose I am tossing a coin and I want to know what is the likelihood of heads coming or tails coming. So, what I can do is that I can toss the coin a number of times. For example, I may toss the same coin 100 times. And then I observe how many times heads had come and how many times tails had come. So, let us say that we had got 60 times heads and we had got 40 times tails. So we can say like this, that out of 100 times the coin was tossed, so out of those 100 times, 60 times there was heads and 40 times there was tails. So therefore we can say that 60% probability is there of coming of heads and 40% probability is there of coming of tails, based on the experiment which we have done. Experiment was tossing the coin 100 times. So this is empirical or experimental. Mostly we will not use this, and we will use the other probability, which is classical probability or theoretical probability. Now theoretical means the actual result, actual world results may be different, but we are just calculating, theoretically what is the probability of any event happening. So let us take an example. Let us say this thing, that if we are tossing a coin, heads may come or tails may come. This is the sample space which I talked about earlier. So if I see here, there are only two outcomes, each one of them is equally likely. So when I toss a coin, there are 50% chances of getting heads and 50% chances of getting tails. So each one of them is having a theoretical probability of 50%. Now if I toss a coin a number of times, the things may be different, like over here it may be 60-40 ratio also. But in this case, since the outcomes are equally likely, we say that each one of them is having a theoretical probability of 50%. Now how to convert that percentage probability into a number? We basically want a number for probability. We want to know the probability of any event, how likely that event is to how likely that event can happen. So we want to know regarding that using a number. So for that purpose we use a formula for probability. Now the formula which we use for probability is this. We say that probability of any event, we write it like this, P and then in bracket E. So P is the probability of any event, that is equal to number of favorable outcomes. We'll just talk about what is this favorable upon total number of outcomes. These total number of outcomes are nothing but the total number of elements which are there in sample space. So number of favorable outcomes upon total number of outcomes. Now here let us take this example. Let us say that we want to know what is the probability of getting heads. Since we are using formula, so this comes under classical or theoretical probability only. This is not experimental probability. So we want to calculate the probability of heads in the toss of a coin. So we see here that there are two outcomes in the sample space, heads and tails. And if I want heads to come, that will be called as favorable event. Now why this is favorable? Because the event will happen only if this thing comes. If this comes, then the event does not happen. We say event is coming of heads. So this is favorable. So how many events are favorable out of, actually how many outcomes are favorable out of these two outcomes? Only one is favorable, so we'll write 1 over here. And total number of outcomes in the sample space is 2, so therefore we'll write over here probability of heads is half. Same way if we want probability of tails, that will also be half only. Now let us take another example demonstrating the formula. So let us take the example now of throwing a die. So when we throw a die, there are 6 numbers on the die. So sample space will be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is the sample space. Let us say I want probability of 2 coming. So if I want 2 to come, out of these 6 outcomes, the only favorable outcome here is 2. So there is one favorable outcome and total number of outcomes in the sample space is 6. So therefore probability of 2 will be 1 by 6. Now let us say this thing that in the throw of a die, if I want a number greater than 3 to come. So if I want a number greater than 3 to come, then in this sample space, how many numbers are greater than 3? We have to check this, this and this. There are 3 numbers which are greater than 3. So there will be 3 favorable outcomes. Total number of outcomes is 6. So therefore we will write over here the probability as half. Now there are a few things which you must remember while doing this topic. There are some precautions. The first thing is you must write this PE or the probability of any event which you want to do. The format is this. You use this P, you use the brackets. Inside bracket you can mention the event for which you are trying to calculate the probability. The other thing is you must simplify this answer and you must try writing down in the simplest form of fraction. Now with this we have concluded our explanation of this topic, probability. We hope you do well in this topic and thank you and best of luck.